Now, just a couple of quick reminders before we get started. Today is the last class day of this week. We don't meet on Fridays, so you get a little bit of a break there. That is because we like to give you guys a day to do any assignments that you need to catch up on. And it gives me a day to grade things too. Your only assignment this week is your introduction. Almost all of you have already done that. If you have done it and have not received a grade, it's because you didn't remember to reply to someone else's, and I didn't want to grade it yet until you did that, because that was the other half of the grade. So make sure if you didn't to respond to someone else's. The rest of you, I've graded yours. You all made 100. It was a free, easy 100. So congratulations on that. Today we are going to, one other reminder, Monday there's no class because Martin Luther King Day. The college is closed. You probably know that though. Today though, what we're going to do, and I forgot to open it on this computer, I have it on my other computer. We're going to start chapter 3, which is a chapter that I always dread doing because I find it extraordinarily dull. But you guys will probably appreciate it because it's super easy. It's just introducing different techniques that artists use to create their compositions, techniques that include lines, colors, shapes. Yeah. So we're going to be going over a whole lot of vocabulary words today, but it's all pretty easy vocabulary words like what is a line? What is a shape? So you guys should be fine. We're starting off with these two vocabulary words, 2D and 3D. I think we probably know what those are. Two-dimensional is a plane that is flat. It can be covered with visual elements, but those visual elements, of course, are still two-dimensional. It doesn't automatically become three-dimensional just because you add stuff to it. Three-dimensional space is something that recedes from the plane, such as like a sculpture. So there are 2D arts and there are 3D arts. 2D arts are obviously painting, drawing. 3D arts would be your sculptures or ceramic pieces. Like I said a second ago, today's lesson, we're going to be introducing different techniques. All of them are listed there in the bold. So we are covering a lot of stuff today, but it's pretty common sense stuff like lines, shapes, mass, space, time, motion, light, color, texture. By the end, you should be able to apply those and analyze an artwork to see what lines, shapes, colors, and so on were used to create that artwork. The first piece that we're going to look at today is Gerhard Richter's OOA2, which uses all of the things that we're going to be talking about today in different ways. So it uses lines to depict shapes, because that's usually how you draw a shape, is with lines. There is a large black mass at the very center of the artwork, which has a lot of weight to it. We're going to be talking about weights of colors today, which is a bit of an abstract concept that colors have different masses and weights. But I kind of alluded to it yesterday with Goya's figure with the white shirt, that white does not have as much mass, but black has a lot of mass. It's very heavy and dense, so it tends to recede. The mass that's in the center of the piece that I'm about to show you has a lot of weight because it's an entirely black figure. Actually, I'll just go ahead and show it to you right there. So you can see that lines, not like actual lines, but implied lines, have been used to create all of the different shapes there. And there's that large black mass in the center as well as the black mass at the bottom, which denotes a landscape. There is, of course, an implied space. We can see that there is a foreground and a background in this painting, which gives illusion to a depth of space within the two-dimensional piece. And of course, the paint drips represent the passage of time on that artwork. And there is, of course, implied motion as the soldier is running from one side to the other on the picture, as well as patches of light breaking through and lots of color and texture with the spray paint as well. So there's a lot going on in this one, but you can kind of get a sense of what we're going to be doing today as we go through each of those things. We're of course starting off basic with lines and shapes, but this would be the end culmination of where we're going to get to. We should finish it today. We might not. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see what we get to. But like I said, we're starting off with lines. Lines are the most basic and primary means of recording things visually. There are many, many different kinds of lines. We're going to be talking about each one. It's not that complex. It sounds like it's complex. It's just some lines are wavy, some lines are straight, some lines are implied, some aren't. But lines tend to denote a pathway for our eyes to follow. They can also show actions and movements within an artwork, which you kind of just saw in Gerhard Richter's painting. We're going to be looking at a photograph next called Bismarck, North Dakota, which is almost entirely comprised of different kinds of lines. And that is here. You can take really good notes on this one, but if you know what a line is, you're good. So here is Bismarck, North Dakota. You can see all of the different lines that were used. There's the actual lines of the architecture as well as the telephone poles, but there's also the other lines created by the shadows of those objects. So there's a lot of different lines in there for our eyes to follow so that they constantly move around the composition and they don't just settle in one point. Like I said, there's a lot of different lines. There's active, static, aggressive, passive, sensual, and mechanical. Will I ever ask you to tell me which one's which? Probably not. I don't care that much about lines. As long as you notice that lines can be used to control composition, that's pretty much the basis of what I'm trying to get at with this particular section, is the importance of lines and what they're able to do for an artwork. They can create boundaries, imply volumes and masses, and of course create shapes, patterns, shadows, and textures. This is a great example of one of our more sensual or active lines. There's a lot of movement going on here, but it's considered to be a bit more sensual because of the waves and the curves. Our next one here would be a lot more aggressive, active, and mechanical because of the straight, rigid edges used. Both of these are from a particular movement in time where people were really obsessed with shapes and lines. Another example of lines, but this one combines light and lines as well as colors to create an art piece using neon tubing. Of course, another example of lines. This one is a great example of an implied line. We can figure out that there's an implication that this is supposed to be a rectangle, even though it is not quite finished. This is made of yarn suspended from the ceiling. The yarn has been coated in black paint. And of course, we have lines that can give us texture. The lines that Kiki Smith used for Ginzer here, every single hair is an individual line to give us that feel of cat fur or texture of fur. Of course, another example of implied lines. These implied lines have helped to create different shapes throughout the artwork with Marc Chagall's Eye and the Village. Moving on from lines to shape. So I think we all know what shapes are too. But shapes, there's different kinds of shapes. There's geometric shapes and organic shapes. Your geometric shapes would be your square, rectangle, triangle, circle. Your organic shapes are shapes that are often seen occurring in nature, such as a spiral or a leaf shape. So they'd be easily recognizable shapes, but not your geometric basic forms. There's also biomorphic shapes. Biomorphic shapes suggest a natural form, but they aren't something that's seen in nature. A great example of that, which I should probably just Google because it's not in here. So Henry Moore does something called organic sculptures, which use organic shapes, shapes that look like they should be natural, but they aren't actually seen in nature, kind of like a made up shape. That's why it's called biomorphic. Just to give you an idea as to what we're talking about with biomorphic, because there's not really an example of that in here. Shapes often appear on picture planes, sculptures, as you just saw, and they help to create shapes for the foregrounds, the backgrounds. There's positive shapes and negative shapes. Positive shapes tend to dominate the foreground, whereas negative shapes tend to recede into the background of a picture plane. Forgot to mention, but I noticed Abigail brought food. You guys can't eat in here. You just have to clean up after yourself. So if you're running late and you need to grab breakfast at some point, you can eat in here. So here is an example of shape. Let's see if you can figure out the two shapes. Any guesses as to what two shapes there are? One is, they're both implied shapes. A square and a circle, yeah. So both a square and a circle fall under that geometric shape category. Like I said, they are implied, so it's not like there's obviously a square been drawn out and a circle been drawn out, but we can comprehend that there's a square and a circle being represented. This is a little tougher question. Which one is in the foreground and which one's in the background? Yeah. So white tends to come forward and black recedes into space. So the square would be considered in the foreground and the circle in the background. That's a little bit harder of a question though. Here's another one. This one's fun. This is sky and water. So we have the black ducks here, and then the shadows of the black ducks have been used for the fish here. The fish silhouette is of course also up here. So that's just a fun little one of using shapes, your natural shapes, to create a bit of an optical illusion. Another example of shapes, this one would be a good example of biomorphic. So the shapes look natural, but they aren't naturally occurring shapes. Um, that takes us into mass. Everyone good on lines and shapes so far? Today's not too hard. Especially like, okay, yeah, I can see that. So mass is the physical bulk or appearance of something. Certain things have more mass than other things. When things have a lot of mass, they also tend to have a lot of volume. If they don't have very much mass, they don't have very much volume. Those terms can be used fairly interchangeably. Volume, however, can also be implied to a building. Certain buildings can hold a lot inside of them, meaning they enclose a lot of volume. Volume is also going to come up when we're talking about space, particularly with buildings. A great example of something that has mass is Fernando Botero's artworks. You'll see why in a second when we get to that one. Here is that Botero sculpture. This is the horse. Now, do you think this horse has a lot of mass or not very much mass? A lot. Why do you guys think it has a lot of mass? It's pretty chunky. Yeah, it's pretty chunky. In comparison, you can look up, I think, yeah, there is an Umberto Baccioni. We have this one. This fellow obviously does not have near as much mass as Botero's horse. He is very stick-like and figure-like. Giacometti always makes very stick-like figures. He was interested in the concepts of what happens to the human body when it's decaying and starving, which is not a positive thing to look at, but it's quite a bit different from this one. Both sides of the spectrum there. So math helps us to also delineate different shapes and their importance in compositions, which if you remember back to Gerhard Richter's OOA2, that large black mass was obviously the center focal point for that painting just because it had the most mass in the entire artwork. So that also tends to help guide our eyes to where we're supposed to be looking to in that painting or photograph. Another example of an artwork that has mass here is Elizabeth Catlett's Bread. What part of this print do you think has the least amount of mass? The bread, yeah. The bread is the lightest, therefore it has the least amount of mass in it. So it tends to push forward into the painting. The darkest areas, like this girl's hair up here, have the most amount of mass as well as down here. Takes us to space. Space and mass go along very well when working. Space, generally, we're applying it to buildings, trying to create the idea that there is more space than there actually is within a building is a great example. Like I said earlier, volume also goes along with space. Specifically, when we're talking about buildings, sometimes buildings have a lot of volume. Sometimes the buildings are designed to look like they have a lot of volume, even though they don't. Such as this one. This is the north terminal of the Washington National Airport. Do you think that this terminal has a lot of space? Yeah. Why do you guys get the impression, what helps you to believe that there is a lot of space? The really tall ceilings, yes. And there's something else that helps to give that illusion. Not the lines on the floor. No. I mean, the arches help. Kind of, yeah. There's a big one though. There's something that architects and home designers always include if they want an illusion of space. Windows, yes. Windows and mirrors help to make a room or building feel a lot larger than it is. So the really, really tall ceilings that come up to a barrel vault, which is what this is called, you'll learn about that when we're going over Gothic architecture. And the arches and the windows help us feel like this space is extremely large. Another example of space here, Doug Wheeler has created an illusion that the room continues on a little bit past this wall by adding rope lighting. So lights, mirrors, windows, all of those things can make us feel bigger than they actually are in a space. So technically this wall ends where that lighting starts, but because of the light itself, it's blurred that edge a little bit, creating the illusion that the wall continues on. Another example of space is the idea of implied space or separate spaces. We're going to be looking at an Egyptian painting to discuss what exactly implied space or denotation of spaces are. This is really a great example of a floor plan. So if you've ever seen a blueprint or a floor plan, you understand that there's different spaces within that building. You yourself are not actually inside that building, but you can tell that there's a bedroom, there's a kitchen, there's a living room, there's different spaces within it. And that's exactly what's happening here with Pool in the Garden. So we can tell there's a pool, there's a picnic area, there's a garden, there are different spaces within this setting. Even though it's very flat and two-dimensional, there's that implication of space. I always think it's funny that they chose to illustrate the trees like that. Like they're just chilling on their side. Another example of space here is a really important one for creating an illusion of depth within paintings. We're going to be talking about this one a lot. So there are different ways to create an illusion of a three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional plane, like a paper or a canvas. The different ways to create depth on a two-dimensional surface are listed here. So there is the idea of overlapping, that's placing one object on top of another one to create the idea that there are different layers to that painting or drawing. Overlapping and diminishing size, this is like graduate level over here. This is basic. So it gets more advanced as you go down the line, but overlapping and diminishing size, usually when things recede into space, they get smaller, correct? When you're looking out at the skyline, the further away things are, the smaller they are. So using that and applying that to a drawing or a painting also helps to give an illusion of depth. Another way that artists create the illusion of depth is by placing things in a vertical placement. So the further things are away from each other, they tend to go higher up on the picture plane to try and denote that illusion of depth. And of course, this uses all of them combined. This is like I said, graduate level. So you have overlapping, vertical placement and diminishing size, which is where you would want to be if you're really, really trying to create that illusion. An example of an artist that used that is Cezanne with his still life with apples. He has overlapping vertical placement. He didn't really do diminishing size very well. This particular painting, I always wonder why your book uses this one as an example, because it's not the greatest example. Cezanne purposefully did not try to make things look realistic. For example, this table is slightly tilted up with the plate. So technically, if it was a real table, those fruits would be rolling off. But he did that on purpose. He knew better. He just chose to try and push the limits of what was acceptable at the time. So I don't know why they use that one as an example. There's some better examples of still lifes, but you get the idea of overlapping and vertical placement. And that takes us into linear and atmospheric perspective. These two are big ones. You're going to want to write these down. So I'll give you time to jot this one down because it's going to keep popping up over and over and over again the rest of the semester. So it tends to be a really important vocab word. Linear perspective. Perspective itself refers to the idea of trying to make something look 3D on a 2D surface. Linear perspective is a mathematical system that was developed during the Renaissance period as a way of using a vanishing point and different lines converging at that vanishing point to create the illusion of depth. So it's the idea that you have a line, that's a very bad line, on our eyesight. When we're looking at something, there's always a middle line. And if we stare out at that middle line, there's going to be a point where everything converges. That point where everything converges is your vanishing point. So that vanishing point is really important for an artist that's trying to make something look realistic in a painting. And they need to make sure that all of the lines in the room go to that point. And if we get all the lines there, if we are following our mathematical system and doing our ratios of diminishing size correctly, then everything should turn out really lifelike in our painting. The Italian Renaissance artists were obsessed with trying to make things look as realistic as possible. So it makes sense that they would come up with an entire mathematical system to do so. I hate math, so I am not a huge fan of linear perspective. Like, I don't know, it's not bad to use and it works, which is great, but it's pretty easy to mess it up when you're doing it. You generally need to have a ruler nearby you and know your ratios. Be very good at converting ratios. And then you should be fine. If you ever go, you know how a lot of the roofs in this, all of the buildings here have these tiles on them. If you go into a narrow hallway that has these ceiling tiles on them, and it's a long enough hallway, you'll notice that if you're staring at them, most of the tiles will end up converging together in a triangle-like shape. That's linear perspective. If you ever have free time, you can sit there and draw them and practice it yourself. So some examples of linear perspective we're going to look at in a second. That vanishing point or vantage point is generally your most important point. This is an example of 1 point perspective, and our example we're going to look at today is 1 point perspective. You can do linear perspective with more than one vanishing point though. How many of you guys in here have seen Da Vinci's The Last Supper? Pretty famous one. So that particular painting uses 1-point linear perspective, and the vanishing point for it is Christ, which is why when we're looking at that painting, our eyes automatically go to Christ. Of course, linear perspective combines the ideas of overlapping vertical placement and diminishing size, but it does it in a much more mathematically appropriate way. It's not just eyeballing it, but it's actually measuring things. So like I said, it's a bit more time consuming to do linear perspective than to just eyeball something, but it's going to look right. Some examples of linear perspective. This is 1-point linear perspective. So your vanishing point is at the very end of that road. Your horizon line is right there, and all of the lines converge at that 1 point. Another example of 1-point linear perspective, all of these cubes, the lines on them go to that vanishing point. This right here is 2-point linear perspective. I'll actually see if I can blow this up a little bit. 2-point linear perspective, which has 2 vanishing points. And of course, the lines go to those 2 points. That one's a little bit harder to do. An example of an actual real life artwork that uses linear perspective is the School of Athens. The School of Athens just uses a 1-point linear perspective. It is done by Raphael. Let's see if we can find where all of the lines converge. So I think the easiest way to do it would be to follow the 4 tiles. So you'll notice there's a little bit of a line back here with the architecture. So that would be our horizon line. And you'll also notice that all of the other lines tend to go to a specific area. So where do you think the vanishing point would be? Yeah, those 2 people in the center. So this particular artwork, the School of Athens, is all about celebrating knowledge. It was in a room, it's a wall fresco, by the way, or a wall painting. It was in a room that was being used for civil law purposes, basically like a courtroom. So they wanted to create a artwork that would inspire them to continue educating themselves. So this painting is full of philosophers, artists, and technicians. The School of Athens vanishing point is, you were correct, right in between those 2 figures being Plato and Aristotle. So we have Plato and Aristotle, and they're surrounded by a lot of other philosophers and important figures. If you really are interested, you could probably figure out every single person in this painting. I'll point out a few though. This one in the foreground, who is sketching in a sketchbook, is Leonardo da Vinci. He's really famous for always carrying around a sketchbook to jot down his notes and ideas. The one pouting on a block of marble is Michelangelo. This was Raphael being very mean to him. Raphael complained that Michelangelo complained all the time. And then over here, we see a figure wearing a green hat who is making direct eye contact with us, and that is Raphael. Of course, Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael, being the big 3 of the Renaissance period, are all in this painting. And we're going to talk about this one a lot more later on too. But this is a wonderful example of that linear perspective. With all of the figures removed, you can definitely tell where that vanishing point would be located. Next, we're going to move on to our second one that will definitely be on your test, so you're going to want to write it down. Atmospheric perspective. Atmospheric perspective is a lot less complicated than linear perspective. Atmospheric perspective is just the idea that if things are really, really far away, they tend to be hazy. So we're going to put a bit of a hazy fog or a distortion on the shapes. So almost all of these atmospheric perspective paintings will be applying to landscape paintings. And it's like the very, very far background landscape is in a fog, is what it always looks like, whereas the foreground is not foggy. So it's pretty easy. You don't need any math for this one. Just got to make things look a little blurry. The colors tend to be not as bright when you get really far away either. Pretty easy for this one. Some examples of atmospheric perspective: Asher B. Durand, Kindred Spirits, right here. So you'll notice that the further things get in this painting, the hazier they are and the lighter the colors are. That's atmospheric perspective. This one's pretty easy. Another example of atmospheric perspective, Shenzhou's Poet on a Mountaintop. So once again, the further away these mountains get, the hazier and less clear they are. That takes us to our next concept. We're finally done with space. And we're moving on to time and motion. Time can be quite literal. For example, if you're watching a film, you'll know that there is an obvious passage of time being illustrated in that film. Well, I'll talk about that later. If you're looking at a calendar, there's an implication of time that will be passed, such as the calendar that we're going to be looking at in a second. There's also the idea of an implied passage of time in paintings and cartoons. When you're reading a cartoon in the newspaper or wherever you look at a cartoon, you'll know that the characters are working their way through a story. So there's an implication of a passage of time in that story. Quite literal, an example of a passage of time. This is the Aztec calendar, which illustrates time. Another example of time. This is more of like a cartoon character and the different scenes. So up here we have Saint Anthony beginning his journey, and then he meets someone along the way, and then eventually he meets up with St. Paul at the end. So there is an implied passage of time throughout that story. Another example of passage of time, like I said, comics, comic strips, comic books. There is that idea that time is obviously passing as the characters work their way through the story. And of course, like I said, films also have the idea of time moving forward. Here, this is a film by Christian Marquet called The Clock. For this one, he sat outside of a railroad station and videotaped a clock for 24 hours. It plays on loop. And it goes with the time of the day, which is really cute. So if you ever go and see his artwork, he has a few copies of them throughout the world. And you walk in, it should be the correct time. Like I said, with time, there's implied time. With motion, there's also implied motion. Our figure in OOA2 had that implied motion. We could tell that he was running from one side to the other side. He wasn't actually running. That would be creepy. But there is that implication of movement and motion in his posture, which we can see here as well. Obviously, this is supposed to imply dancing. Krishna is supposed to look like he's dancing. He's not actually dancing. That would be really creepy because he's like a god of destruction. I would not like to see him start moving one day. But there is that implication that he's dancing. And this one is supposed to look like a footballer, specifically a soccer footballer, not like a football, because we're talking about Italy. But a soccer player running. This is obviously not like a realistic interpretation. It's very abstract. Another example of motion, movement of words around a museum. Here is Jenny Holzer's Untitled. And for this, which was for a while located within the Guggenheim Museum in New York, is a ticker tape. If you watch the news at the very bottom, there's that ticker tape that runs on a loop. That's exactly what this does. So the words move and rotate around the different levels of the museum. So they are moving, there is motion, quite literal motion with this one, not implied, it's quite literally moving. We're gonna look at another Jenny Holzer on Monday, or not Monday, Tuesday. And of course, another example of actual motion is Alexander Calder's kinetic art. I'm going to go back so you guys can write the definition of kinetic art because it is on your test. So kinetic art is an artwork that moves. It really like moves, rotates, does an action. Alexander Calder is the first artist to make use of a moving artwork. He did it a long time ago in the early 1900s, but today a lot of artists do it. So he is also the artist that coined the term kinetic art or moving art. He's really famous for his mobiles. They're very, very large sculptures that work the same way that a baby mobile does if you are super familiar with them. Those are pretty outdated though, but those are those things that spin around on top of the crib. That's exactly what these do. The crib ones tend to be mechanized. His is not. It just rotates based on airflow. And they're extremely large. Most of them. He does have some small models, but they're just models. The actual art piece itself tends to be huge. This takes up the entire ceiling of the museum. And like I said, it will rotate each level. So this one will be spinning, this one will spin. They'll all spin depending on the airflow in that building. Moving on from movement to light, we looked at some different examples of light already. Using the color white in a painting can give us the idea of light or brightness, like Goya's shirt. Also, you can talk about literal light bulbs being used in art. We looked at that one that used the neon tubing already. That made use of actual lights. Lights are really important when we're talking about paintings, specifically in drawings, because it can denote to the viewer where their focal point is. We've already seen an example of that too. We'll talk about the specific word for that in a second, because there is actually a vocabulary word for it. But before we look at it, we're about to see the power of light by looking at Daniel Chester French's study of the Lincoln Memorial. So the Lincoln Memorial is just one, but these two photographs we're about to look at are very, very different. They were taken at different times of the day at the Lincoln Memorial. So there's a very different presence that each one has. The same place, just a different time of the day. Very, very different photographs were made depending on how the lights and the shadows were captured with the photograph at that time. So how do you guys think this Lincoln looks? What do you think his atmosphere is? for his expression. Friendly, angry, sad, happy. This one, he looks surprised, yeah. He has like a bit of a shocked, raised eyebrow look on his face. That's because the light is hitting from down below on this one. And here, what about this one? He looks a lot more angry, or at least like serious in this one. So we have shocked and surprised and serious. Same place, same Lincoln, very different outcomes based on light. So light is extremely important with compositions, just like that linear and atmospheric perspective were. The idea of using extreme lights and darks has a specific vocabulary word that you're going to need to know for your test, and it'll be popping up in a second. I thought it was the next one, but it's not. A value is the tones of light. So if we're talking about this one here, the relative lightness to darkness of the work, one of these has a lot of values, the other one doesn't. Any guesses as to which one's which? Does this one have a lot of value, or does this one have a lot of value? Which one has more of an extreme light to dark? The first one? How many of you guys say the first one? Second one. The second one. So value is that depth or range from light to dark. This one is mostly light. There's not as many darks in that one. And that takes us to implied light. For the implied light, we're mostly talking about paintings instead of photographs. Photographs really do have light and dark. Paintings, you have to create the appearance of light and dark, so there's an implied light. The idea of having extreme lights and darks is chiaroscuro. That's a really important vocabulary word. That's it. It's on your test. Chiaroscuro. It translates to extreme lights and darks in Italian. That idea of using really, really light and really, really dark helps to create a sense of depth. It helps to guide the viewer's eyes to the focal point, and it gives a bit of a dramatic effect to the paintings as well. Let's see. The first artist to make use of chiaroscuro, and the reason why that word exists is because of this guy named Caravaggio. Oops. So he would create paintings that looked almost like there was a spotlight in the room, hitting the character that he was trying to paint. So the spotlight would be up here somewhere and it would be coming down here. Of course, there was not an actual spotlight because we're talking about the Italian Renaissance and there weren't light bulbs then. So it's the illusion that there is light to make the main character appear a lot brighter than everything and everyone else around him. Another example of chiaroscuro is Rosa Bonheur's Harvest Season. We'll go straight to that one. So here we can see the extreme darks and the shadows as well as the extreme lights as the sunlight is hitting them. So it's an implication that there is a sun somewhere in this picture, and it is hitting them directly, creating intense shadows. And some more examples of light. We have literal light bulbs. Motordom by Keith Saunier. This is not quite the use of a light bulb, but this is a photography, well, it's a digital video collection. It's a photograph of that movie. This one uses the shadows to create the shapes while the light helps to outline it. So it's a bit of a reverse image. Of course, another example of literal light. It takes us into color. So color is getting towards the end. For color, we're going to talk about the color wheel. Understanding how different colors work together. Most of you probably already know these things. I keep mentioning though that different colors have different weights, different colors have different emotions or feelings attached with them as well. So color is an extremely powerful tool for artists to make use of. So, like I keep saying, colors have different weights, different meanings. Our main color wheel that we're going to be focusing on is just the rainbow Roy G. Biv. We're not going to go into all of the other colors today. So we're just doing red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And then it goes into the science there as well a little bit. Different colors have different wavelengths. So the idea of colors is that they are light refracting through a prism and then reflecting back to our eyes. So technically, your blue shirt, Felicia, is just a prism reflecting back into my eye. It's weird. The science of colors is very strange and very interesting if you're ever really curious about that. There's a lot of YouTube videos that go into it. There are a few terms that go with color, such as achromatic. Achromatic is a painting that is made of black, white, and gray. Black, white, and gray are not considered colors. They are called neutrals. If you call them a color, I won't be mad because I still do it sometimes too. But black, white, and gray are considered neutrals. They are considered neutrals instead of colors because they're not used by themselves. Usually they're used in combination with a color to either lighten or darken it. So if you add white to blue, it'll turn into a light blue. If you add black to blue, it'll turn into a darker blue. And of course, if you combine the two, you get gray. So an achromatic painting would be like the one way back here, this one. That's an achromatic artwork. Usually black, white, and gray. And of course, hue is just a fancy word for color. Value is referring to the relative lightness or darkness of a color. So here's where I was talking about earlier. If you add black to something, you are shading it. If you're adding white to something, you're creating a lighter tint or a darker shade, which changes the value of the hue itself or color. And of course, there is the idea of intensity or saturation. Certain colors are more intense and more saturated, just meaning they're more pigmented. So here is our color wheel. We will be spending a little bit of time on this one. but most of you probably are even your colors. So of course your primary colors, who remembers the primary colors? Yes. So we have red, I can't reach yellow, but it's up there, and blue are our primaries, and those are mixed together to get your secondary colors. So if you mix blue and yellow, you get what? Green. And if you mix blue and red, you get violet. And if you mix red and yellow, you get orange. Those guys are considered secondary because it takes the primaries to make them. And of course, if you add more violet to your red, you get a red violet. If you add more red to your orange, you get a red orange, and so on. Those are tertiary colors. Also, before we move on, your analogous colors would be colors that are right next to each other on the color wheel. We're going to talk about those a little bit more in a second. So violet and blue violet, they're touching, they're analogous. Analogous colors go really well together. So if it's a color that's touching the colors, they're a good color combination to work with. They complement each other. And then, of course, your complementary colors are directly across from each other on the color wheel. They also go really well together. So violet and yellow, even though that's a weird color combination in my head, they go well together. And like I mentioned earlier, if you add more white or more black to something, it will change the value of that hue to either a lighter tint or a darker shade. So if you can't remember your primary colors and you're having issues trying to keep up, they are there. I'll give you a second if you need to write those. But your primary, secondary, and those tertiary or intermediate colors are listed. Next, we're going to go into a little bit of the psychology of the colors, meaning what they mean. So it's not quite as literal, more interpretive. And that is the idea that there are cool and warm colors. Psychologically, for whatever reason, our brains perceive certain colors as being cool and other colors being warm. Your cool colors are, of course, your blue-green side of your color wheel, and your warm colors would be your red, yellow, orange side of the color wheel. Why? I don't know, but that's the way it is. Warm colors tend to push out towards us into space and they have less weight. Cool colors have more weight or mass to them and tend to recede into space. So for example here, which one is the warm color? Red, and that means blue is the cool color. Technically, red is supposed to appear to be lighter, whereas blue is supposed to appear heavier. The black square in the background does not help because, of course, it has the most mass. Therefore, it's very much in the background. And of course, color schemes, that's the idea that certain colors look better together. They are more harmonious together. And like I mentioned, those analogous and complementary colors are the ones that work well together. A monochromatic painting, I kind of mentioned that yesterday with Whistler's Blue and Gold Nocturne. But that is a painting that's done in almost entirely one hue, just using different values. And of course, analogous. Those are colors that are right next to each other. So this would technically, I don't know why they use it as monochromatic. This is achromatic. And of course, analogous. Here's some examples of artworks that use analogous colors. I believe this one uses complementary though. Yeah, that one uses complementary. Complementary being ones that are directly across from each other. And that takes us from color into texture. Texture can be quite literal texture, but it can also be implied, like Kiki Smith-Ginzer, the cat drawing. There was an implied texture with the fur thanks to the line choices that she used. So there are actual textures that can be felt, but there's also an implied texture that can be used with lines and shading. So literal texture example would be Merritt Oppenheim's Object. You guys are gonna love this one. Everyone always loves this one. It is a teacup, saucer, and spoon that has been coated with deer fur. She was part of the Dada movement. Very interesting group of people. They were very interested in the absurd. You never see. And then of course, another example of texture, you can use different glazes in ceramics as well as designs to create the idea of textural feelings on ceramic objects. Which, by the way, if you ever go down the art hallway in the Allison Fine Arts building, we have a table of free stuff, and there's some really pretty ceramic pieces on it right now, and they're free. If they don't get snatched up by the end of the week, they go in the trash. So we replenish that table weekly. For anyone that's interested, there's a bunch of books on it. At one point, there was a coffee maker. I think that's gone now. Yeah, you guys should check that out. A more of an implied feeling of texture can be seen in the Starry Night. So there's that implied feeling of there's a textural feeling with this painting that you could reach out and touch the different levels of the paint. And of course, with this one, you get an implied texture of brass. And he has a little fur coat on here, and she has some fur, and there's a little brush in the background. You get that implied feeling that there's different textures being used. Another thing about texture, though, is this idea of impasto. Impasto is a vocabulary word that's going to keep popping up. So you might want to jot that one down. But impasto is the idea of using paints, specifically oil paint, in a thick enough consistency that it's like a butter or a cake batter. So like if you whipped butter, that consistency. You get that with oil paints and only oil paints by adding less turpentine. The less turpentine you use, the thicker the paint's going to be. And it will dry with that thick texture. onto the canvas. So what that means is that your canvas will actually have a ridged texture to it that you can see and feel, which is exactly why Van Gogh's Starry Night looks like it has a texture to it, because it was painted with an impasto technique. So it really does have a texture to it. There's bumps and ridges and edges on each of those brush strokes. And congratulations, we made it through the really, really boring lecture. So I'm surprised I did that all in one day. It usually takes me 2 days to get through that one, unfortunately. But we made it through in one day, which is awesome.